Welcome. I'm Katharine Biele with the League of Women Voters of Utah. Tonight, we welcome two people who will help us navigate the upcoming special election in our state. As many of you know, Congressman Chris Stewart has resigned from his Congressional District 2 to attend to his wife's ongoing health issues. Be sure to check out vote411.org. That's our one-stop shop for all things voting, and will include our voter's guide with questions and answers from the candidates. CD2 changed with the last census, and you may know that the League has sued the legislature over its gerrymandered congressional maps. The Utah Supreme Court has taken the legislature's motion to dismiss under advisement, but you can still find a recording linked on our website, LWVUtah.org. Stewart's resignation caused the legislature and the governor to set new dates for this year's special election, which will encompass many municipal elections too. To explain what has happened and how we as voters can prepare, we've invited Robert Gehrke, government and politics reporter at the Salt Lake Tribune, and Dr. Zoe Nemerver, assistant professor of political science at Utah Valley University, for a conversation to clear up any confusion in this election cycle. Our Voter Services Director, Katie Dahl, will also be joining and will help field your questions from the Q&A button below. So let's start with Robert Gehrke, who will give us a little historical perspective on how we came to have a new election law this year, after which we'll hear from Dr. Nemerver about what we need to know to participate in this year's elections. Robert.
Yeah, so this is a rare occurrence actually in Utah state history. We haven't really had congressional vacancies in the middle of the term. The last time we had it was 2012 with Jason Chaffetz. And when that happened, there was a little bit of an uncertainty because the law was really vague on how we are going to replace these members of Congress. There was a group of legislators who wanted it to be the delegates choosing. The governor didn't go along with that. There were threats of litigation they wanted the governor to call a special session, bring everybody back, let them rewrite the law to clarify it and give the delegates a lot more control. The governor didn't do that. And so there was threats of litigation. They actually amended the Constitution, allowing themselves to call them back into the future. But flash forward to now, we end up with a similar situation, but it's a little bit different because these elections, the dates they have to be on are very dependent on when the resignation actually takes effect, because there has to be a filing period, a signature gathering period, time for ballots to go out, all of these things. And so they called themselves into special session recently and set these new deadlines. So the special election is going to be September 5th, which is later than usual. It's right after Labor Day. And then the general election is going to be November 21st. And most of that, again, is dependent on the timeframes that they have to have under both state law and the federal Help America Vote Act. The special election will be on September 5th. We can talk a little bit later. We can probably discuss it later about the registration requirements, but Republicans, generally speaking, Republicans have closed primaries, so you have to be a registered member of the party. Democrats are open primaries, but Democrats are, it looks like, not going to have a primary. Kathleen Reeby is their nominee. So it's just on the Republican side, that September 5th primary, and you have to be a Republican, a registered Republican, to vote in it. Part of what they did in that special session was set a deadline for voters to change their registration from Democratic to Republican. If you're unaffiliated, though, you should be able to become a Republican if that's what you choose to do up until Election Day and cast a provisional ballot.
So are we going to have a new law every time something like this happens?
Yes, probably. It's, again, a very rare occurrence, but because these timeframes, the deadlines are so malleable. It's hard unless they just happen to line up with the previously scheduled primaries and general elections, then yeah, you're going to have to adjust the schedules accordingly. There was some talk of doing it different ways, of shortening the signature gathering period, shortening the filing period, doing different things to try to keep the schedule tight. And they wanted to get this done quickly because frankly, from what we've been told, Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, doesn't want to be down a Republican. He's got a very narrow margin in Congress. And so he doesn't want there to be a gap, this seat to go unfilled by a Republican when he's, got such a narrow margin in Congress. So they were trying to do this as quickly as they could from a practical standpoint. And they do run into some trouble, frankly, because, having the election the day after Labor Day is probably a pretty good way to drive down turnout, and having the general just before Thanksgiving, and then have these poll workers or these elections officials having to certify the elections right after that puts a really big burden on them. But they just wanted to get it done as close to the original deadline as they could and as early as they could so they can fill that seat to help the speaker out.
Dr. Nemerver, do you have something to add to this? And do you know how much it's going to cost us?
Well, I don't have privy to those numbers yet, but this election, as Robert said, will be quite different in the timing. Both the primary and the general are much later. We're used to a summer primary. Now we have a primary. People come back from Labor Day. They're, trying to unpack the coolers, get the kids back into school mode, immediately need to get that ballot returned. Fortunately, because voters are mailed their ballots ahead of time, there's more leeway. So people, might be more inclined to return their ballot before they head out for Labor Day weekend. And then the general election is just a couple days before Thanksgiving. We're used to those early November elections. It's going to be much later in the holiday season when things are, when I think voting is not at the top of people's minds as they're trying to remember, did they get enough cranberry sauce and how many people are coming for supper? And so for the congressional district, if people are unsure, because these are fairly new maps, if this is their representative in Congress that they're voting for, you can go to, if you just Google, find my member of Congress, the first hit on Google will be the official congressional website where you put in your address and it tells you which congressional district you're in. So if people are unsure, because we are still getting used to these new maps, they can enter their address and they'll figure out which district they're in, if it's in the second, or if they are immune from this mad election that has been sprung upon us. And like Robert said, really the primary, at least for now, is just for Republican voters, because no other parties have had contested primaries. They've chosen their nominee at the convention, and in the other parties, nobody has gathered enough signatures to join the Democratic or Libertarian or other party primaries. Unaffiliated voters can still register as Republican to participate in the Republican primary on September 5th if they wish to do so, but it is too late to switch from another party affiliation to Republican. It's only unaffiliated voters that still have that opportunity to participate in the Republican primary. And then Robert has information on the handful of municipal elections that are also happening at the same time.
Yeah, I guess we probably should note, and I don't know if this is something you're going to do. Did you want me to talk about the candidates on the Republican ballot right now?
Please do, yeah.
So Celeste Malloy was a former staffer for Congressman Stewart. She's an attorney. She is registered right now in Cedar City. She is the Republican nominee that was chosen by the delegates. So the way it works, we have the delegate system. The delegates are chosen. 700 of them roughly got together in District 2. And they had a crowded field, and there was Greg Hughes and Jordan Hess, Celeste Malloy, Becky Edwards, Bruce Huff, a whole bunch of people on the ballot. Celeste Malloy kind of pulled an upset, was chosen as the party's chosen nominee, or the party's endorsed nominee. And so she, under the rules in these special elections, rather than sending two to the primary, which they oftentimes do if somebody doesn't get a certain threshold, they're only allowed to send one. So Celeste Malloy is their choice. But then Becky Edwards and Bruce Huff both gathered enough signatures. Bruce Huff was certified today as a candidate, so they gathered enough signatures. So those are the three candidates who will be on the primary ballot on September 5th for the Republicans. Becky Edwards is a former state representative and ran against Mike Lee last year. Bruce Huff is a longtime Republican National Committeeman and is probably best known for being the father of Juliana Huff and her brother, whose name I'm blanking on right now, Derek, the Dancing with the Stars twin or brother and sister. So, but Bruce is a longtime activist in Republican politics, and so it should shape up to be a pretty interesting race. I think what you've got mostly at play is this regional tension, because Becky and Bruce are both on the Wasatch Front. Celeste is has her roots in southern Utah, although there was some disagreement about whether she was eligible to run, and we can talk more about that if you want. But so you've got this rural urban tension and also a northern southern tension, because these districts are so big, they spread all across the state. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this shakes out. And you mentioned municipal elections. It complicates municipal elections in some ways, because those municipal elections also got pushed back. So their primaries, if they're having primaries, are going to be September 5th again. But for cities like, say, Salt Lake City, Mill Creek, that have opted to go with this ranked choice voting and do away with the primary, they're going to have this special election, but not a municipal primary on that day. So it's going to be a little bit complicated, a lot of moving pieces at play.
Yeah. So do we have any, I mean, name recognition seems to play a part in elections in the past. There aren't many candidates who have much name recognition. Celeste Malloy is basically unknown. Becky Edwards probably has the best name recognition, but I don't know how this is going to play out. Do either of you have any idea how the electorate is going to react?
So importantly for Celeste, she has received the endorsement of outgoing Representative Stewart. And so for constituents who were supportive of and loyal to Representative Stewart, they might say, well, I just want to vote for who he wants to replace him. And so she may be able to get votes that way using his name recognition through that endorsement. But it is interesting in that Becky Edwards is the only candidate with legislative experience. She's worked as part of the legislature before here in Utah. She has an idea about the policymaking process, where we see two, outside candidates, one a lawyer, Celeste, the other a businessman. But that's not to say that candidates without political experience haven't been successful in the past. We can look, for example, President Donald Trump, he used his business experience as an asset during his campaign. So I think the candidates, even though they don't have a lot of name recognition, they do have unique experiences from each other. So it's up to them on how they choose to leverage that. They might say, well, so-and-so's only ever worked for government and they won't bring a fresh perspective. And the other person might say, well, they've only been in the private sector and I've been a selfless public servant for decades. So it definitely leaves a lot up to the candidates in terms of how they want to play their hands in these next couple months.
So there's a bit of a controversy. Maybe Robert can talk about this, about Celeste not voting in the last two elections. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the question arose whether she was eligible to be the nominee or to even run as a Republican candidate, because the Republican rules say that to be eligible to file to run, you have to be registered Republican in the state. And Celeste had moved to DC to work for Congressman Stewart, and she says she did not register to vote there or vote in and she did not vote by mail absentee in the 2020 or 2022 elections. So as a result of that, if you don't vote in two elections, the lieutenant governor puts your voter registration on inactive status. So there were objections raised basically that said she was not an active Republican. the bylaws don't actually say she has to be an active Republican. She updated it after she was notified by the lieutenant governor's office a couple days after she filed to run. All of this came out obviously after she had won the nomination. And that's part of the issue that was raised, because the Republican bylaws say any objections have to be raised before the vote. Ultimately, the party stuck with her, forwarded her name as the nominee. There was talk of lawsuits, but I haven't seen any yet. And the lieutenant governor's office made a case that she was eligible, both under the Constitution and the Republican rules and state law, to be the nominee. So I think what's going to be interesting more than anything is to see if this hurts her any in terms of support among voters, because you do get this sort of rift between some of the more conservative Republicans who didn't think she was eligible and the more mainstream Republicans who might be leaning toward Becky Edwards or Bruce Huff anyway. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. And also worth noting, I kind of referenced it before, but so much of this district again is southern Utah or rural Utah versus urban. I think she's probably a favorite to win this, but as Zoe mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty in who's going to actually turn out given the timing of this, and the potential for to pull an upset. Maybe her reputation was actually damaged by this controversy. I don't think so, but we'll see.
So Zoe, do you have an idea of turnout? In the past, municipal elections have been pretty low turnout events.
Yes. This special election might help municipal turnout, actually, because people, we have very low levels of information available to voters for municipal elections, especially when you take away party cues. It makes it difficult for voters to use that heuristic of partisanship to cast their ballot. Voters may be intimidated by ranked choice voting. And so I think having this high profile special election, once people are there to fill out their ballot, even if they only knew about the congressional special election, if they see other offices, they might stick around. What we call down ballot voting, and we can think about down ballot attrition, where the further you get down the ballot to the lower profile races, you see fewer and fewer responses. So this might be a boon for municipal elections, but overall it will be much lower turnout than a normal midterm race, right? So because of how our districts are drawn, you could even have groups of friends that, half the friend group is voting in this election and the other half isn't. So that deteriorates some of the social pressure to vote. People that you normally talk to, they may be like, oh, well, my district's not in an election. And that can get rid of some of that healthy peer pressure for people to turn out. And then the timing is very difficult for voters. Again, right on two major holidays, turnout will be difficult. Also, the name recognition, right? If you have an incumbent that people cherish and they are excited for, you're going to have people turn out to support the legislator that has been serving them, that has maybe helped them with constituency casework. They're going to say, yeah, when I needed my passport renewed and it got lost, Representative so-and-so helped me. Like, I'm definitely going to turn out every 2 years to vote for them. But here we don't have an incumbent that can, pull those constituents into the voting booth. And so I think it will be quite a low turnout election, which makes it even more difficult to predict. Because if we're trying to predict an election outcome based on past elections, when you have lower turnout, it's not uniform across who turned out in the 2022 election. Some groups are much more likely to vote others. And so we have an electorate with different groups, overrepresented, underrepresented compared to past elections.
That kind of makes the mobilization and ground game pretty important, which probably plays to Becky Edwards' advantage. Having run for Senate last year, she has this network of people out there that she can tap into. Having had to go gather signatures, and she gathered like 12,000 of them, if I'm not mistaken. Bruce Huff gathered 11,000. Gives you sort of a network that you can tap into. I think I misspoke earlier when I said Jason Chaffetz. That special election was 2012. I don't know why I said that. It was 2017. But I was just looking at the numbers on that. Again, three-way race, off year. The primary, 40% turnout. There were about 73,000 ballots cast. So about 40% of the active registered Republicans in that third district. And that was a race that John Curtis won. So 40% probably seems a little bit ambitious, I think, this time around, just because it is held so close, as I mentioned, to those holidays. And it is so kind of disrupted by not having a primary in some of the larger cities. If you're interested, I mean, I can run down the cities that are doing the alternative voting, but it's a lot. Several of them are in this district, and so I think it could disrupt the turnout a little bit. And I would be surprised if we reach that 40% mark.
Well, it's really interesting that, Robert, you mentioned the 73,000 number, because we think of turnout in percents, but we think about 73,000 and we know how many signatures had to be gathered by Huff and Edwards. If they can get 11,000, 12,000 signatures in that short amount of time, and let's say we expect there to be, we'll just be optimistic and say there'll be 73 ballots cast again. If they can do that, get that many supporters and do that 3 or 4 times over, ideally growing their volunteer base, those people on the ground going door to door each time, this could really come down to who is putting in the legwork, going door to door, because with a low turnout election, you don't have to get that many votes, right? You could think if Becky Edwards is going to spend 16 hours a day, every single day until the election, going to people's doors, like that might be the hustle it takes for her to upset the party's chosen candidate.
And mobilization is so important, and especially with mail-in ballots, mobilization is different. It's not getting your people to the polls on election day. It's hounding them repeatedly over and over and over until they return those ballots, and then you can leave them alone. So it does put a premium on organization.
How confusing is it going to be to have ranked choice voting municipalities at a different time than other municipality elections? And maybe you said you could go through the cities. That would probably help. Yeah,
so I don't think it's going to be that confusing. I just think it's going to be less incentive for the people in those cities to participate in the special election. Because if they had those municipal elections, maybe they're really excited about voting in their city council race, and they also live in CD2 and will vote in that race. But the cities that are doing alternative voting methods, and again, there are some deviations in the way they're operating these, but it's Mill Creek, Genola, Salt Lake City, Midvale, Payson, Vineyard, South Salt Lake, Heber, Kearns, Lehigh, Woodland Hills, and Magna. Part of Mill Creek, I think, is in CD2. A good chunk of Salt Lake City, Magna, South Salt Lake are. Kearns, I believe, is. Lehigh, I think, splits, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that. So a lot. There are several impacted communities that are in the CD2 that are using ranked choice voting this year, and may be impacted by the decision. It may impact turnout in those cities.
So how about mayoral elections? I mean, those are coming up too, and some of them are a little more interesting than others. Is that going to drive voters out?
Well, so I mean, that's kind of hard to say because it's such a region by region issue. Obviously, in Salt Lake City, maybe the most prominent mayoral contest between Rocky Anderson and Aaron Mendenhall. They're not going to have a primary, so it's not going to turn out voters. It probably wouldn't turn out a lot of voters anyway, because it's the most liberal part of that entire district. And so, but you look at some place like someplace more rural, that they're having a regular primary and it's a contested city council election or something of the like, you could see that really teasing up turnout and working to one candidate's advantage or the other. So it's so dispersed and so varied. I think it's probably hard to say exactly what role that's going to end up playing.
So Zoe had talked about mailed in ballots, but you can still vote in person. Is that right? Zoe, maybe you can
Yes,
take-
the ballot is mailed to every registered voter. It's just an option to mail it back in. People can put their stamp on it, get it mailed. It has to be postmarked by the date of the election, September 5th. If people don't want to mail it in, they can also drop it off. They can look up drop-off locations, or if people don't want to fill out the ballot that was mailed to them, they can go vote in person with the ballot that they're handed by the poll worker. And so there's lots of options for voters depending on, maybe they want to get it done right away before they forget, or they would rather vote in person than voting remotely. Yeah, so it's very flexible, which I think will definitely, with, first of all, the holidays, some people will be doing ranked choice voting for the first time. It's candidates that are kind of hard to find out information about, so more low profile candidates than perhaps we're used to. Having that ballot ahead of time so people can think through their answers will be greatly beneficial to voters. Even if they don't end up using their mail-in ballot, they can see it ahead of time, think about what they want to vote, and then go do it on election day.
Yeah, I mean, the mail-in voting has been a real pivotal move in Utah. I think it's when the state started piloting it, we saw some of the largest increases in voter turnout. We were near the bottom. We've moved up above the middle, if not near the top, in terms of our voter turnout. And I think the mail-in voting had a lot to do with it. Plus, as we saw during the pandemic, having gone through this process a couple times before we had to kind of lean on it a little bit more heavily during the pandemic, made a big difference. And so I think it's been a real benefit to Utah in terms of just increasing participation, and not just participation, but also informed participation. As Zoe said, when you get the ballot early, you can actually do your research and understand some of the candidates a little bit more than just voting by letter, if they have an R or a D, or voting by the name you like or whatever. So it's made a big difference.
As we've seen in the last legislative session, there are still legislators who are concerned about mailed-in ballots. They don't think they're safe. They think there are security measures that are needed. Can either of you speak to the safety?
So I think the best thing that people can do to alleviate some of those concerns is go watch the process that they go through. It's really pretty remarkable, the security measures that are in place. There have been additional security measures added. For example, now they're installing cameras at the drop boxes, because of the concern that they were somehow compromised. And so I think people need to go see it. There's signature verification. They have different versions of your signature on file. If it doesn't match the signature on file, they send a card to your home. You have a couple weeks to cure the defect or cure the questions about it. And so there's all of these opportunities. And I think the most important thing about it is all of these are sort of stacked in a way to increase voting, but have layers of security in place, redundancy in place. If they end up getting spit out by the computer, for example, then they have teams of people looking at the signatures visually, and they have certain criteria that they're looking for to decide if it's counted or not. I mean, it's not foolproof. There's no elections that are foolproof. There's always going to be somebody who can try to game the system, beat the system. But on a large scale, the effort you have to go through to try to forge somebody's signature, to steal a ballot, forge somebody's signature, send it in, to do that on any large scale that's going to meaningfully impact an election is sort of hard to wrap your head around why somebody would bother doing that. So you might have some thoughts too.
Right. So just because people may be dropping off their ballots into a box, it does not mean that once your ballot goes into a box, it's just automated, like the Scantron for multiple choice exams in college, right? So actually I had my ballot signature rejected because I was like signing it because my fiance was taking out the mail. I was like, oh, take this with you. I just need to sign it. And I was like distracted cooking dinner. And so my signature was a little sloppy and I got a letter back. And so it's that level of care that the state is going through, right? Saying like, the signature seems not right. We should double check and get them to send us back a signature to verify. And so even though it seems more perhaps anonymous, the voting, right? Because there's a lack of connection when you're not seeing that poll worker and putting it in to the poll box yourself, you're just dropping it off. It's not fundamentally a different process than in-person voting. It's the same level of scrutiny, if not higher. And the great thing is if voters do feel insecure about voting by mail, putting it in the mail, or even using a drop-off box, you can go drop it off in person on election day. If you don't like the fact that the ballot is mailed in the first place, you can still have your mail ballot at home, study it, make notes on it, and you can go on election day and get a brand new fresh ballot and vote there. And so there's options for all voters, if they're not feeling comfortable with vote by mail, they still want XYZ precautions to be made, they have the option to vote in person until they do feel comfortable, which is great.
And this is a funny quirk that I have. I love getting my mail-in ballot and then going over the ballot and then going and voting on election day. I'm an old-fashioned guy. I like the ritual. So
Well, you do all of the above.
yeah. So well, you get your cheat sheet, you get to do your homework, you get to study. You can even fill out the ballot and just drop it off there if you want. And then they still give you a sticker. You still get the I voted sticker, which is the best part. So there are a lot of options. They're doing a pretty good job of making it convenient and easy, removing the burdens that might be in place to participating in the elections.
Yeah. We have definitely looked at trying to get those I voted stickers to send out.
Some
Katie,
states send it with your mail ballot. They just have faith that you will vote. So you get that sticker right away.
that sounds great. Well, I like the idea. So Katie had to jump off, so I'm going to go through some of the questions that have come through. Nikki Nelson asks, are the local election primaries still on August 15th? She may have come in a little bit later. So Zoe, when are the primaries again?
They were moved to September 5th to align with the congressional, which is confusing. I agree that will be confusing for a lot of voters if they had already marked it in their calendar, but at least it's a move back, so they're not going to miss it. They might be wondering where is their ballot, but it's coming. It was just moved back. That I think that is confusing anytime you have unconventional dates, let alone dates that were removed. And that's something that you can get information on by going, as you mentioned, vote 411, but also going to the state elections page, to your county elections administrator. They'll have that clarifying information as well.
This is kind of a tangent, I guess, but it was also confusing for the candidates because I was talking to some of the candidates in Salt Lake. Their financial disclosure filings are tied to 30 days before the primary, right? Well, they don't have a primary this year, but then the date of the primary got moved. So when is the filing period for that? They got it all worked out, but you don't want to miss those financial filing deadlines because they can get disqualified from the ballot if they do. So, but they got it figured out and everything's good.
Do we have any idea how much these elections are going to cost this time?
So if my memory serves, and I can check this if you want, but I believe the total amount budgeted for the elections was $2.5 million. Which is about what it costs to run a statewide election. But there was also some portion of that money that was set aside for voter outreach or education to try to inform people that, hey, we've moved the elections, just the thing that we're talking about right here. And so I think there's about $2 million appropriated for the elections. Democrats aren't going to have one, obviously, so we're just administering it for Republicans. They didn't know that at the time they appropriated the money, so there may be some left over at the end of the day, but that's about the figure that they're talking about.
Okay. So Erica Wangsgard asks this question. I like to look up candidates online. Sounds like there isn't any way to learn about candidates running in the municipal elections. How do I learn about municipal candidates? Got some good ideas?
Zoe, do you want to field that one, or?
Well, I have a list of advice on congressional candidates, but let's directly answer Erica's question first, Robert.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the beauty of these municipal races is that they're small enough that they're all grassroots campaigns. You can go to your city's website and find out on the city recorder's website, find out who's running. Typically, they have at least a phone number, email, website. Not all of them have websites. They run on pretty lean budgets, but there's a way to contact them. And honestly, talking to all of these people who are running for these city council races in Salt Lake City, in South Salt Lake, they want nothing more than to talk to their constituents. So I think starting at your city recorder's website or your county election clerk, you can get a sense of which district you're in, who you need to contact, who's filed to run for those races, and kind of do the legwork there. There's not an easy way to do it. Obviously the Tribune usually does a candidate guide but we focus mainly on Salt Lake City, so that probably doesn't do you much good if you live outside the city. The League of Women Voters 411, Katharine, if you want to plug that again.
Yes, well, we're trying to make it as easy as possible, and we are covering all of the municipal elections this year. So by all means, look at vote411.org. There should be information about all of the municipal races and candidates. Admittedly, not all of them answer our questions, but there will be information about who they are and how to contact them, which is important. And then again, Robert earlier mentioned that you should go to your county clerk to sort of see how the process works. Your county clerks are very open to the public. So I would encourage you to contact them or the lieutenant governor for that matter.
Yeah, they've really made an effort to try to, because of all the questions that are raised and because of some of the suspicion, they just want to be transparent, and they will show you how they run these things, and you can go in and see them set it up. You can see how they're counting, see how they're verifying signatures. They want to do that. So contact your county clerk.
Mm-hmm.
For the federal election, for the congressional election, if people are looking for information on candidates, the candidates have websites. Very easy to remember: CelesteForUtah.com, BeckyForUtah.com. I don't know what Huff's is, I'll be honest, but
probably Huff for Utah.
Yeah, should go with the pattern. But at least for Becky Edwards in the Republican primary, and then for Kathleen Reeby, the Democratic nominee, they have service in the state legislature. So you can look up what committees they've served on, what bills they've sponsored, have those bills been successful. So they have legislative track records. If you're wondering what they might be like as a member of Congress, you can look at what they were like as a member of our state legislature. For candidates that don't have experience in elected office, it's a little bit harder. So candidate Huff, his website does a good job of presenting his positions, but he doesn't have a lot of past experience. He works very hard in explaining how he's going to be the true conservative in the race. Likewise, Celeste Malloy doesn't have, a list of bills she's sponsored like Becky Edwards might, but she has a list of her experiences and her perspective on what would help Utah. There are also websites focused on transparency about electoral races. So Ballotpedia is a good website. It's a play on Wikipedia. It tabulates information across candidates. So you can search by a candidate, you can search by a congressional district, you can search by a place and time. Like if you want to know Utah elections 2023, it would list them out with a hyperlink taking you to each page. That's Ballotpedia. Project Vote Smart's another website that has information about political candidates. And then, of course, if at least in the Republican, if you're participating in the Republican primary, you can go back and watch the debate recordings that will have, they'll have more than just the three candidates we have now, but that could be a good way to know what the dynamic was like in the pre-convention stage. And then perhaps more debates will be scheduled, especially for voters who might be deciding between a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate, or a Republican candidate and a Libertarian candidate. But as of now, the only debates we've had have just been between the Republican candidates. As far as I don't know, Robert, if there's been more put on the schedule yet.
I don't think they have scheduled them yet, but I suspect there will be at least one, probably maybe more, probably mid-August, because they want to get them done before the ballots go out. I did find brucehuffforcongress.com is the his website, not the number 4. He bucked the trend, I guess, but yeah, it's and you take those websites with a grain of salt, because it's always the candidates putting on their best face. But we are also at the Tribune working on profiles of each of the 3 Republican candidates that will be coming out probably in the next few weeks, and obviously in the general we'll do the same. So,
and if this will be an election, which we seem to think it will be, that has a very large grassroots presence, a strong ground game. If somebody comes knocking on your door asking you to vote for so-and-so, that is a good opportunity to ask questions, to pass along questions to the candidate. If you're at, a county fair or a public event and you see a table for a candidate, that is a great opportunity to go up and ask them questions. Even if the candidate isn't there, if you can get the question to a volunteer, they will probably get it to the candidate, but also you can test how responsive is this candidate. When I ask them their position on XYZ, do they get back to me with an answer, right? And so if you see people out and about, which I think we will start to see a lot of grassroots organizing, that's another great example to make connections with candidates.
And please check our website, lwvutah.org. You can also go on our website, you can go to any of the local leagues, which tend to do candidate forums. Salt Lake County does a lot of candidate forums. I know Davis County does too. Weber County will be having some. We now have local leagues in Moab and St. George, as well as Cache. So keep your eyes on our website as well. Doesn't hurt. I think most of the questions that are coming through now are like thank yous, and they love to vote by mail. We have one person who not only likes to vote by mail, but she likes to have a glass of wine and research the candidates.
Whatever it takes. Yeah, that's important.
Better than taking wine into the poll station, I guess.
That's not going to work.
I mean, all the polling that's been done since we adopted vote by mail has been very, very positive. Obviously, it's taken a little bit of a dip, given some of the Trump conspiracies surrounding it among his supporters. But by and large, it remains very popular, and the numbers are great, and the turnout is great. And I know it's kind of I think a philosophy of League of Women Voters, but the more people we have participating in a democracy, the better the representation is likely to be, provided we can get the gerrymandering issue resolved.
Yeah.
There's my statement for the evening.
Our national president today had a little webinar, and the first thing she said is, we are all Americans. So if we can just remember that and vote that way, we'll all be better off. I will ask you one question that you may not be able to answer, but oh well. The LDS Church recently came out with a letter saying that you shouldn't vote a straight ticket anymore, or you should look at both sides. Do you think that will make any difference? I mean, Kathleen Reby is the Democrat running for Congress. Most people, I think she hasn't got a chance, but what do you think?
So in general, it's a good idea to approach each race as an independent race. Just because you vote for, let's say, the Democrat in one race, on the same ballot, you don't have to keep voting Democrat. You can, that's called straight ticket voting, where you just vote one party the whole time. If people vote straight ticket by coincidence, then that's different than if they just feel compelled to have some sort of party loyalty or consistency, when really one of the great aspects of our federal system and having different levels of elections is you may think that perhaps Utah Republicans are really well suited for state issues and you want to see Republicans win in state legislative races, but at the national level, because the national legislature deals with different issues, you think it'd be really great if we sent a Democrat to deal with national issues. And so I don't know how much effect the letter will have, but I do think it's a good sentiment that people should be willing to do the research, to think outside the box. You don't have, for example, if you are registered as a Democrat in the general election, you can still vote for somebody of the other party, and you don't have to, you're not going to get exiled. Nobody's going to know, and you don't have to change your party registration necessarily either. And so, especially in an election like this that has some perhaps like unconventional candidates, open seat elections tend to be of a different qualitative nature, that people voting maybe the party they're not used to voting might be what's right for them. I don't know. I don't have the insight into what like the agenda behind the letter was, if there was one beyond just asking people to, really take advantage of the fact that you're getting your ballot early. You can do the research and you can perhaps vote more so than just using a heuristic of party. You can learn a little bit about each candidate and think about, okay, well, if this is a race for a position in the legislature where our representative for congressional district 2 is going to be expected to be part of a team of 435, am I looking for somebody who's entrepreneurial and a business leader, or do I want somebody who has previous experience with the policymaking process? What do I value in this particular context?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that historically, over the last several decades, the single block of voters that have been most loyal to the Republican Party have been LDS voters. It's the single biggest predictor of a voting trend in the country, and especially in Utah. So it might have some impact, although I think the religious leaders telling everybody to think for themselves, I think the people who are going to think for themselves were already thinking for themselves and maybe still voting a straight party ticket. It's also worth noting, I think, that in 2020, the state did get rid of straight party ticket voting, is when the bill was signed. I don't remember if it took place in the 2020 election or 2022 election, but the bill was signed in 2020, ending straight party voting in Utah. So, you can still go through and vote R or D, but there used to just be, there was one box at the top of the ticket that said Republican, Democrat, and you'd get all of those candidates. So we've already kind of moved in that direction in Utah. So I'm not confident that it's going to have a major impact, but it might make people think a little more carefully when they fill out their ballot.
Nationally, they say the youth vote is making a lot of difference. Do you think that is going to make any difference in Utah? Do we have much of a youth vote here?
Well, at least for congressional district 2, the heart of Utah County, where we do see that really large young adult population, is not in the district. It goes like to the west of Utah Lake. But we still might see some effect, but I think when we think about youth, but when we think about Utah County, especially with just like a burgeoning population of young adults, lots of young families, and then, decades to come, that's definitely going to be where we're seeing a growing proportion of our electorate residing. Robert can speak more to this as well.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with relying on the youth vote to make a change politically is that they tend to not vote very much. There has been data going back to what we were talking about LDS voters, that young LDS people are less likely to be conservative Republicans than their parents or the grandparents. So there does seem to be a trend moving in that direction, both among LDS voters nationally and in the state of Utah. I think the challenge again is getting young voters to turn out. And while there are a lot of people who are involved, and passionate about issues, there's a lot of people who, like the rest of us, probably don't even know that there is a primary on September 5th, right? So it's partly about voter education and getting people involved. I do think that maybe some of the Supreme Court rulings, some of the events of the past few years have got young people a little bit more engaged. I think the student loan issue is a big one that's driving a lot of engagement. So maybe some of these issues will come together and create a perfect storm that will drive up those participation numbers, but they haven't been great in the past. And it's always young people are the next great world changers, and always will be, because they never actually seem to show up and actually make the difference that they could make if they do turn out to the polls.
The league is trying to change that too. We some of our leagues participate in democracy classes at the high school level. And for anyone who doesn't know, you can actually register to vote when you are 16 here in Utah. And the county clerk will hold that until you're 18 and able to vote. So
it's also possible that if youth become more active, that we see candidates preemptively catering to the issues that younger voters care about. So younger voters might be more forward thinking. They might be thinking about climate change, for example, not something that's going to affect, people who are in retirement now, but, later 50 years from now, it will probably be a very big issue. And so we might see candidates' rhetoric change a bit, or as Robert was saying, that younger LDS voters are less likely to be conservative Republicans than their parents. We might see, even if we still have Republicans overwhelmingly winning general elections, we might see in primaries moderate Republicans start to do better. So there might be some subtle changes, but we know that candidates love to win elections. And so they are attuned to this as much as we are. And they are going to be thinking strategically about, well, if young voters come out in droves, am I equipped for that? Can I be attractive to people who that might be their first, second election? It'll also, I think, be for the youth vote much easier to have a higher turnout for the general election when they're at university. There's mobilization efforts, groups on campus. September 5th is, at least at UVU, right at the start of our semester. It's kind of heyday. People are trying to figure out which classes they're enrolled in, getting their routines down. But I think once the semester is in the swing of things, we'll especially see those college-age students have more of an opportunity to make space and time to vote.
Yeah. One of the most interesting data points I've seen over the course of the last several elections is that there is this little blue island in Red Provo, if you look at the precinct level data, and that blue island is right, the student housing at BYU. I mean, it's not, these young LDS college students are not as, likely to vote Republican as their parents, and that they can make a difference. But it's gotta, you must be present to win. So you got to show up if you're going to make a difference.
The fortunate thing about the Thanksgiving timing is that if college students have the whole week off and their mail ballots are mailed to their parents' house where they stay outside of the school year and not to their dorm, then they will get back to their parents' house and be able to fill in that ballot and drop it off, rather than having to worry about, getting their parent to mail their ballot to them at school. Because I know sometimes it's very difficult for students to go home to where their ballot was mailed, and they don't necessarily want to change their registration to school because then, then over summer break, when they're back home, then their primary ballot's getting sent to school, but now they're home. And so maybe we'll see it easier for youth, for college students to vote if they're able to go home during that window that their ballot's there. If they get off the Friday before Thanksgiving and then they get home that weekend, they'll still have time to drop it off before the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week.
Well, I appreciate both of you coming by today. I think this is going to be helpful, and we have recorded it, so it will be on our website. I'd like to ask you if you have any concluding remarks. Shall we start with you, Zoe? Is there something you'd like to remind the voters before we jump into the election season?
Yeah, the state bureaucracy is paid for by our tax dollars. They are here to answer our questions. It's not their only job, but it is totally reasonable for a voter to feel entitled to ask questions of people who either work in the county office, the city office. Likewise, if you have questions about the congressional races or, your member of Congress, that the bureaucracy is really well equipped to answer questions. There are a lot of resources online, and that it's not weird and it's not a burden. I'm a political science professor, and even I still find myself going to, find my representative at congress.gov, and that's exactly what it's there for. And I think especially as we see alternative timing of elections, transitions to ranked choice voting, special elections being called, that using those resources is more important than ever, including this webinar.
Okay, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we talked a lot about the special election, the congressional election tonight, and that is important, but I'm glad there were a lot of questions about municipal elections because those are more important. I mean, frankly, not a lot is coming out of Congress these days, but your local government actually has, rubber meets the road responsibilities, and you can actually make a difference in those elections. You can talk directly to these representatives. And I think it's great to see people putting their focus there. Again, I'll plug Vote 411 for you if you don't.
Thank you.
Because it is hard to get information about a lot of these people, but they're also very accessible in a lot of ways. I mean, they're trying to scrape for a couple thousand votes or even a few hundred votes in a lot of cases. And so, you're one of those potential voters. And so they're going to give you more attention than somebody who's, we're talking about 73, 74, 75,000 in a congressional election. So, I just think would encourage people to engage at the local level, at that municipal level. Yes, the congressional election is important. I'm not saying it's not, but really engage in those local elections if you want to make a difference in your community.
Thank you so much. I think this has helped people be a little less confused. We will continue to try to help you not to be confused. I encourage you, as Zoe said, to go to your friendly bureaucrats, and also to your local newspapers, which will be doing all kinds of good election coverage. Shout out to the Salt Lake Tribune. And of course, Vote 411 and our website. We will be doing as much as possible to make this clear for you and as easy to navigate into 2024. Thank you both for participating, and thank you all for coming and enjoying this particular webinar. Good evening.
Thank you. Happy voting.
Thank you.